All right, guys, so today we are moving into narrowing our focus on British colonization that will eventually become the United States. So we're going to first take a look at the southern colonies. When I say southern colonies, I mean Virginia and Maryland, which are often called the Chesapeake region, and then North and South Carolina and Georgia. So all the way from Virginia down to Georgia. Again, Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. So in general, here's what we're looking at for these colonies. They are plantation economies, all of them, whether you're in the Chesapeake or the Deep South. And this is mainly what they grow, tobacco and rice, and they're dominated by the plantation economy. And when I say that, I mean that there's slavery in all of these colonies, starting from their birth all the way up until Civil War in the 1860s. So all of the colonies, even Georgia, which will be a debtor colony, will have slaves as early as their beginning. A lot of the beginning of this region will be started by indentured servants. So here's what an indentured servant is. Write it as a note off to the side on your notes. An indentured servant is one who has their passage to the New World paid for them on the promise that after a certain number of years, usually 7, during those 7 years, they will work for whoever paid for their passage, and then they will be freed after that. Sometimes this is referred to as the head right system. Write that as well. The head right system is one who promises to develop the New World for their country and are given land to do so on the promise that they will bring people over to work that land. So the rich person would pay for the passage of the poor people, would be given land by the government. The indentured servants would be indentured or indebted to their person that paid for their passage and would work for them for 7 years until they're freed, typically 7 years. So that's the way that this system usually starts on the plantations. Indentured servants are usually poor, urban whites from the cities in Europe. And then when they realize that they have to pay indentured servants at the end of their servitude and they lose the work, then that is no longer economically viable for many of the plantations, and instead the slave trade starts. They will enslave human beings, mostly from Africa, and maybe even some natives, and force them to work, and they're never free and they don't have to get paid. So economically, that is the standpoint of plantations. In the southern colonies, we have a very aristocratic atmosphere, meaning that the rich are rich and the poor are poor. Large land holdings are in the hands of very few families. That is what I mean by aristocratic atmosphere. It's very sparsely populated, and we will not see a lot of education in the South because, in these southern colonies, because there's not a lot of people together. There's not a lot of people paying taxes, and so it's too expensive for very small towns to have large churches and to have large schools. And a lot of the South will be dominated by some form of religious toleration. When I say religious toleration, I do not mean all religions, I mean all Christian religions. The Church of England or the Anglican Church will be the most important in the South, and Catholicism will be mostly tolerated, unlike what we'll see in some of the northern atmospheres in the New World. So let's talk about the Chesapeake. When I say Chesapeake, I mean Virginia and Maryland area, mostly on the coast, even a little bit inland. So the first state that's part of the Chesapeake region is Virginia. It is the first British colony in the New World. So 1607, this is where period 1 ends and period 2, the time periods up on my wall, begins. So 1607, the colony of Jamestown is founded. It's the first permanent British colony, the first successful one in the New World. Hint, hint, Roanoke, that was not successful. It was founded by the Virginia Company, and the Virginia Company is a company that received a charter, like a grant from King James I, to start this colony, received funding, and was to make it successful for Great Britain. Their idea, their goals, was to find gold, to convert Indians to Christianity, and to find, we're still stuck on this new route to the Indies, still trying to find trade to what is now called, what some people then knew wasn't India, but called the Bahamas area, the West Indies, because it is west of their old world. So new passage, new trade market with the West Indies, the Bahamas. The Virginia Charter was part of the basis of the Jamestown colony, and here's what it is. It gave overseas settlers the same rights as Englishmen in England. So that attracted colonists to go over there, the same rights of representation in government, the same economic rights. So essentially saying our colony over there is going to be the same as it is over here. But the issue with Jamestown is like they get there and it's a whole new world, a whole new land, and they have no idea what to do. So it's very tragic the first few years. The first few winters, over half of their population dies during the winter just from being cold and hungry. So disease, war, famine, winters hit the Jamestown colony extremely, extremely hard. And one man kind of shines as an example of Jamestown, and we know him because of the Disney movie Pocahontas, and his name is John Smith. Captain John Smith was actually an effective leader organizing the colony beginning in 1608, a year after its conception. And his motto, love this, was, "He who will not work shall not eat." So his idea of, we're going to rough it out here, you got to play your part. He was supposedly, this is true, this part's true, captured by the Powhatan chief, who subjected him to what could have been a mock execution. In the movie Pocahontas, it's a real execution, but historically we think it's more of a ritual. He wasn't actually going to be killed. And he did have a relationship with Pocahontas, not a love relationship. She was like 12 and he was like 35, so that's disgusting. He was perhaps saved by Pocahontas and had kind of like a working relationship with her as a liaison between the white settlement and the native population. So that is the true story of Pocahontas. Eventually, they failed so hard in Jamestown that their charter is taken back, so the government no longer condones them as their own entity, and the royal crown takes over the colony of Virginia, and it becomes a royal colony. So I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Before that happens, though, the colony of Jamestown is taken over by John Rolfe, who is actually going to be the man that Pocahontas really marries. Pocahontas 2 is a better movie. And it's all false as well. And what they do learn from the natives at Jamestown that helps them survive is the growing of tobacco and the curing of tobacco. And people in Europe were wild about tobacco once it was discovered in the New World. It became their new drug. And King James II, one of the King James, actually said tobacco is detestable and it makes your breath smell bad, but dang, does it make me money. He didn't say that exactly, but I paraphrased. So one thing in Virginia that's very influential and we look to as the first instance of democracy in the New World is the House of Burgesses. And essentially the House of Burgesses is an assembly authorized by the London Company in 1619 in Virginia. It's like a mini parliament in the British American colonies. So people in British America realized that they weren't getting the communication between the British Isles and the New World is very difficult. So how are they to rule us? How about we set up our own little parliament here? And it's a representative self-government. Most representatives were substantial property owners. They were the rich guys who had all the money. And essentially, the House of Burgesses was advertised as a way to attract people to Virginia, which was kind of seen as a death trap at the time because so many people died. Your chance of survival in Virginia was like half of what it is in Europe. And the survival expectancy rate in Europe wasn't great at this time period. So attracting colonists to the New World was done through advertisements of, look, we have self-government, we have freedom of religion, and we have cool food, and you can get out on your own as a farmer. So after all this happens with John Rolfe, John Smith, Pocahontas, the colony kind of fails. The Virginia Charter is revoked by James I, sorry, it's not the second, in 1624, and it becomes a royal colony directly under his control. So he has more power over the tobacco that he hates but makes him a lot of money. The next region of the Chesapeake is Maryland. Maryland was given to Sir George Calvert for a Catholic haven. So essentially, it's part of Virginia. They cut up Virginia, and the new king is in town, Charles I, and he gives it to Lord Baltimore / Sir George Calvert, same dude, to make for Catholics. And in 1649, please remember this date, Act of Toleration, 1649, it is decreed that there is guaranteed toleration to all Christians in the New World. So yes, we call it a toleration act of religion, but really it only allows Protestantism and Catholicism. It does not allow Judaism, Islam, agnostics, none of that. But it's a step in the right direction coming from Great Britain, who's like Catholic, Protestant, and they kill each other all the time. So at least there is some toleration here. What is funny, though, is that the death penalty was the consequence for not believing in Jesus Christ in Maryland. Yes, you heard that right. Instituted the death penalty for anyone denying the divinity of Jesus. That includes Jews and atheists. What? And yet we, right now in United States history, point to this as a shining example of toleration. Not the best. The motive behind the Act of Toleration of 1649 was Catholics are seeking to protect their faith, but also build colonies in the New World to go against all these crazy Protestants that are coming over. Maryland is probably the most shining example of Catholicism in the New World that wasn't Spanish, because all of the other Spanish colonies were Catholic, because Spanish don't do well with Protestantism, Inquisition. So this is the example of British Catholicism. So in general, combine Virginia and Maryland in your head here for a minute. This is what life in the Chesapeake was like. Disease took a heavy toll, like 10 years off your life heavy toll. The life expectancy in Europe, -10 is your life expectancy in Virginia. These diseases include malaria, dysentery, typhoid, things that Europeans hadn't been exposed to previously, especially mosquitoes. That's fun. Half of all born in early Virginia and Maryland did not live past age 20. Half of Marylandians or Virginians did not reach their adult years, and less than 25% of men lived to see 50, women only 40 years old. Another issue in the Chesapeake in the early years was there were no women. These charter companies and these joint stock companies would send men because it makes sense, like farm and building houses and roughing it. That needs to be men. But then when they get there, it's like, okay, well, how do we sustain a colony if we have no things that make babies? So the scarce women means that the cooking, the cultivating suffers. I'm not trying to be like gender roles, pizza rolls, not gender roles. I'm not doing that right now. I'm just saying in this time period, without women, it was not going well for the colony of Jamestown. But those women that were there married extremely early because they were snatched up like that. And most men couldn't find mates. Many of them struck it out alone and ended up going back to the New World because they did not the Old World, because they did not like their chances in Virginia. All right, let's talk about the economy in the Chesapeake. Tobacco. There you go. That's all you need to know. I told you guys already. Oh my gosh, I told you guys to write this down earlier. Oops. Headright system. A headright system is a person who paid for the passage of white indentured servant received 50 acres of land. Some planters use the system to acquire enormous tracts of land. So it made the rich even richer. Let's be real. And indentured servants, I already went over that. Men agreed to specific years of service, usually 7, in exchange for passage to America. And you and I are going to read a letter called Letter from an Indentured Servant by Richard Frythorn. And it is going to be very telling of life in Jamestown and how much it sucked. At the end of their contract, they were usually given acreage or money or other goods to start their own little farms. Eventually, though, because those landowners had only so much land, and then as their indentured servants graduated, for lack of a better term, they were running out of land to be given. So former indentured servants, if you came later during the system, you were given so little land, if any at all, that there was no way you could succeed as your own farmer. So those that got in there early were the winners, and indentured servants later it was a crappy system to be a part of. By 1700, planters brought in about 100,000 indentured servants, representing 75% of European immigrants. So most people coming over were indentured servants. All right, so let's look at a specific instance of issues in the colonies. In 1676, great story, Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. Remember, that's the Chesapeake region. So by the late 17th century, there's large numbers of frustrated freedmen. When I say freedmen, I mean former indentured servants. Those rich landowners ran out of land to give them, so the land that they did give them wasn't viable for a commercial crop. It was more just sustainable. So they were very poor, had very few belongings, very little amounts of land. They're also frustrated because they're too poor to own land. They can't find wives. The men to women ratio is still very low. Men greatly outnumbered women. If they wanted to move west, they had the issue of being threatened by natives. And Governor Berkeley at the time, Governor Berkeley at the time, he was generally friendly toward the natives who traded with the colony, and the House of Burgesses didn't really protect colonists in a sense of ordering attacks on natives if the colonists themselves were attacked. So the poor, it's kind of like a social class uprising. The poor feel like they weren't given a fair shot, feel like they aren't being protected by the government, and the rich from the natives if they want to expand. And so Nathaniel Bacon, he's 29 years old, and this is stuff you're going to want to write out to the side here. He's actually an aristocrat. He's actually a rich guy in Western Virginia, and he's a member of the House of Burgesses. He kind of feels the pain, for some reason, even though he's rich, of the lower classes, of those wanting to move out west and the former indentured servants, and he mobilizes a militia to protect whites from Indians. So their militia massacred Indians, went into Jamestown, set fire to it, and ran Governor Berkeley out of the city, which is hilarious that it's a rich guy who was like literally in the House of Burgesses with Governor Berkeley, who eventually ends up chasing him out with a militia of like redneck from the backwoods of Virginia people. The rebels were opposed to the aristocrats. They were opposed to the House of Burgesses for not protecting them, and opposed to the Indians. So what furthers this story even more, makes it interesting, is that Nathaniel Bacon will die of disease, and Governor Berkeley, after his death, comes in and crushes the rebellion, comes back to Virginia. But the significance of this is that planters see the white indentured servants as too difficult to control, and that will lead them to turn to slavery. So if we have these freed indentured servants that are going to turn against us, that are technically part of our civilization, part of our government, have a say in the House of Burgesses, why would we use them when we can enslave random people from a different country and not have to pay them and not have to deal with these white men's crap? And this is the increase of the use of black slaves in Virginia and the decrease of the use of indentured servitude. So this is a turning point of the transition from using whites as labor to using black enslaved Africans as labor. The planter elite here will start using the race card when referring to laborers as well, and will essentially encourage poor whites to discriminate against blacks, making there be a separation between whites and blacks. So whites, even the poor ones, feel superior to the blacks, and the blacks are further put down the chain here. The planters feared, essentially the rich people that own the land, they fear that the poor whites and the African slaves will come together and fight against them and kick the crap out of them, because there's way more poor whites and slaves than there are planter elite. But if you pit the poor whites against the blacks by telling the poor whites that they're better racially than the Africans, then they won't be allies again. So the planters effectively psychologically control America and start the race issues here. And we see Bacon's Rebellion as a turning point of the use of indentured servitude and the beginning of racial superiority, that attitude that begins. Here is a little painting of Bacon's Rebellion in the setting of fire to Jamestown. And here is my rendition of Bacon's Rebellion. Not really mine, found on Google Images. Much better. Bacon's Rebellion. All right, so let's move on to the Carolinas here. When I say Carolinas, I mean North and South Carolina. There are two colonies here, but in general, Carolinas in 1696, I'm sorry, it's like 1670s that Carolinas begin, but their true start is in 1696, and here's why. Slave codes were adopted during this time period. When I say slave codes, I mean they are a measure to protect whites from the instance of blacks rising up against them. It controls what slaves can do, how they can marry, where they can live. If you are a freedman, your limitations, there are limitations on freed slaves as well. So this time period, we can point to 1696, the slave code adoption in the Carolinas, to the beginning of the slavery system in the Americas, essentially, saying this is where the harsh reality that slaves had to live through from 1696 all the way up until 1865 when they were emancipated. This is where it starts. And this idea is influenced by the sugar planters from the British West Indies, think the Barbados area. The West Indies increasingly relied on slave labor to get their sugar and their coffee and their tea planted. And that idea, when those people move from the West Indies, when I say West Indies, I mean like Bahama area, Haiti, Dominican Republic, up to the Americas, they bring the slave code idea with them. The Carolinas will be largely sugar plantations and rice plantations, and they will take those raw goods and ship them to Europe. They're a huge exporting colony. And then we have the beginning of Charleston, which is Charlestown, Charles like King Charles. And this is a very aristocratic atmosphere that happens in the Carolinas, that the rich have all the land and the rich have all the power. So interesting fact, the Carolinas will be established in 1617, and by 1710, blacks outnumber whites in that area. We will see in 1712 the split of North and South Carolina. So 1712, North Carolina, it is still a major rice and sugar exporter, and the people that officially will create North Carolina are more poor, white, or religious dissenters escaping persecution in Virginia and other more northern colonies. North Carolina will become mostly democratic, independent, and not as aristocratic as other southern colonies. But also they're kind of known as the worst treatment of natives because you have those backwoods whites that will fight against natives on the western frontier, what they call the western frontier, which is like the other side of North Carolina. Let's talk about Georgia. Georgia is the last colony founded in 1733. It was founded by James Oglethorpe, which is a really fun name, Oglethorpe. And it was created as a place for debtors to go, a debtor colony, as well as a buffer state, because remember, the Spanish have Florida. And so they created like this, it's kind of a colony. It's where we send our poor people between South Carolina and Florida as a buffer. But actually, Savannah, Georgia will become like a really important place in the colonies. It will be very, very diverse. A lot of Germans and Lutherans, as well as Scottish Highlanders, will move to Georgia. Not so much Catholics, but because it's more like we know we're debtors, we know we're poor colony, there will be a lot of like toleration in Georgia. All right, so let's look at the South as a whole. I am talking Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, and Georgia here. Colonial slavery is what we think of. I mean, when you think of the South in general, pre-Civil War, you probably think of slaves. It starts as soon as the colonies begin. Most slaves will come from the West African coast, think like Senegal, Angola areas. And originally it was coastal tribes would move inland, coastal African tribes would move inland to African nations, enslave them, bring them to the coast, sell them to European and American buyers. Essentially, the slave trade begins like that and will continue to include those slaves that had kids and the slave kids and the slave kids' kids, and it will just be a constant cycle. 40% of slaves captured by Africans in the interior died on the way to the coast because of harsh conditions. Now, when you compare that to the amount that die en route from Africa to the New World, 50 million. Oh my, that's insane. Of all the slaves brought over to the New World, the majority of them ended up in North America in British colonies. Remember, the Spanish were very apt to enslave the natives, while before the native populations were mostly eradicated. From this time period, we get the term the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is what we ascribe to be the journey of slaves from Africa to North and South America and Central America. And it's just horrific conditions. Slaves often chained by the neck and extremities to the deck floor, packed into spaces about the size of a coffin. You lay in your own filth, in your own waste. In some cases, the next deck was only 18 inches above the floor, so 18 inches, sorry, you can't really see that, would all that a human had to lie there. They couldn't turn over. They had to lay on their back the entire voyage. Very sparse food, if any, and water. And only only 2/3 of those survived the Middle Passage. That's how harsh it was. And any sort of rebellion would be squashed immediately and the slaves just thrown overboard to die. Survivors, those that survived the Middle Passage, would eventually be sold at auction blocks in like Charleston, which was a huge slave market, or Newport, Rhode Island, another huge slave market. This sort of slave trade, Middle Passage thing, mostly will start after 1700. So our early colonies, like Jamestown, starts in 1607. It's mostly white indentured servitude, but look to that like Bacon's Rebellion area, like the 1670s, to see the switch to the use of slaves and the Middle Passage and the things that we just talked about. Here's an example of a ship on the journey to the New World with slaves. They're all packed in very, very tight, and this would just be one of many. If you can see kind of the blurry first picture, there's multiple decks of slaves packed in like that. Let's discuss slave codes. As Africans grew in number, that threatened the white population, and to enact severe control over them, they passed slave codes. Here are some examples of slave codes, and we're going to look at some more in class. Blacks and their children were property for life of their white masters. So their children, their children's children, everyone, unless your master sells you or frees you, which was likely not going to happen, you were their property. And if you had children, your children are their property. It also made it a crime to teach slaves how to read and write. And one thing that before the popularity of the 1700 slave trade began, often native slaves for the Spanish, like Native American Spanish slaves, could convert to Christianity and win their freedom that way. And that will go away. And Great Britain especially will be like, no. So conversion to Christianity would not be grounds for freedom from your enslavement. And essentially the idea of racism developed during this time period, that whites are superior to blacks, will not go away until the 1960s, and some people argue even until this day. Racism will be seen as a legal entity, that whites were seen as superior to blacks until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So, life for a slave in the Deep South is kind of really harsh, much more harsh than the middle colonies and the northern colonies, and here's why. It was brutal and isolated. Like, your plantation was your plantation, you never saw beyond that. And also, the slave trade was so active that if you had new slaves coming in every day and you could buy them, why would white masters treat their slaves kindly when they're so disposable? The idea of rice and indigo farming is very backbreaking, very brutal. Rice is on the ground, as is indigo. It's always hot and muggy in the South. So Southern slaves suffered the most because of those types of plants, because of how isolated it was, because of the availability of those rich aristocrats to just buy more slaves. So why treat the existing ones well was the overarching notion. So let's contrast what it was like to be a slave in the South versus what it was like in the middle colonies. In the middle colonies, um, sorry, in the middle colonies, tobacco was mainly farmed as compared to rice and indigo and sugar in the southern colonies. And tobacco farming is just not as bad, not as backbreaking. And for some of the processes, you can actually be indoors to do it. Also in the middle colonies, plantations were closer together, meaning that it wasn't just one system. Often, slaves worked for multiple masters, could build more relationships around, and were given more freedom in that sense. Also, in the middle colonies, there was more natural reproduction, so the slave population grew, and it was more encouraged for essentially slaves to have their own lives. Now, I'm not saying those are good things. I'm saying in the darkness of the slavery system, being in the middle colonies was so much better than being a slave in the southern colonies. Slave culture, sorry, I lost myself on my notes here. Slave culture became a mix of American and African folk culture. We have and here are some examples here. The Gula language is kind of evolved off the islands in South Carolina, and it is blended English with several different African languages like Ibu and Hausa. This is just an example of, at first, many Africans would stick to their culture, and then when they came in contact with other Africans and with whites, they would kind of mix it all together while still staying true to some of the bits and portions of themselves. We also have devolved from African culture the banjo and the banjo and the bongo drum. Sorry about that. That will be brought over and actually put into American culture. Think Appalachian culture. We think of like Eastern Kentucky, I think of a banjo, actually came from African culture. The ring shout dance will later contribute to the development of jazz, which is a very Black culture type of music. And what they will do very interestingly with Christianity is they will mix a lot of Christianity with their African rituals. So the idea of an afterlife kind of mixed with the idea of the Exodus in the Bible. And in the Exodus, the Egyptian slaves are led to the promised land by Moses. And many Africans will take hold of that idea of Christianity and mix it with their idea of afterlife. Because the idea of an afterlife and the idea of a God that will free his people appealed to those that were enslaved in harsh conditions. So many people ask, well, why didn't slaves just revolt? They did, but the system was so put down on Africans that there was no way they could have been successful, despite the fact that they had no access to weapons. So about 250 instances of like 10-ish slaves joining together in a revolt or conspiracy to revolt are documented, but the largest of which is the Stono Rebellion in 1739. This is the largest slave revolt in the history of the 13 colonies. So this is in South Carolina. The slaves attempt to gather together and march to Florida, Spanish Florida, and because the government in Spanish Florida had promised them freedom to any slave who reached there. And this was just an idea to weaken the British colonies. The Spanish were like, yeah, let's try and free their slaves. So they're stopped by a militia, and the Africans will fight back for quite some time, and 25 whites are actually killed, but hundreds of Africans are slaughtered after that. Scores of slaves will be killed by this militia. But the significance of this moment is it frightened whites, and we will see a change in slave codes. It will become even more strict than it previously was to be a slave in the Americas because of the almost success of the Stono Rebellion. All right, so let's look at the social structure of the 18th century, and then we shall be done. Here is the ladder. Essentially, at the very top, we have those plantation owners, and these are the people at the top of the social ladder. They rule the economy, they monopolize political power, and they're essentially in charge of whatever religion is important in the area. So they're leaders in the church, leaders in government, and leaders in the economy. They have dominated Southern society. Underneath that, we have those small farmers here, and they are the majority of people not considering. So when we think of the South, we think of those rich aristocrats with all the land, but in actuality, it's mostly small farmers. These are considered far below the power and prestige. They do not have much say in the economy or in the government. Maybe they own 1 or 2 slaves, maybe they rough it out on their own, and they have very modest sized farms. Below that, we have landless whites. And landless whites are often those that were former indentured servants that were unable to gain land or money or power from being freed because the indentured servitude system kind of crapped out there at the end. Below landless whites are those that are still the indentured servants. And again, these decrease in numbers as the increase of slave population, especially after Bacon's Rebellion happens. And they're bottom of the food chain, but they're still told, you're better than slaves because they're black. So at the very, very bottom, we have freed blacks, which is a very, very, very small portion of the population, and then slaves. So at the very bottom of those black slaves and freed blacks, they actually end up being the largest social group in the South. Oh God, you scared me. Being the largest social group in the South. I'm sorry, that was Miss Aristia. But because they're told that they're lesser than, that they end up being bottom of the food chain. All right, characteristics of Southern society in the 18th century, we're talking 1700s, compared to the middle and northern colonies, Southern society is underdeveloped. And I don't mean backwoods, uncivilized. I mean, there's just not a lot of cities. The life revolved around plantations. Everything was about the plantation economy and making money. And there's no roads because there's no major cities. There's no major thoroughfares for people to get around. So transportation is really poor. And the way that people got from throughout the colonies was waterways instead of, compared to the north where there are major cities, there are major roads paid for by eventually tax dollars. All right, so that's all we're going to do today on this video. If you scroll forward in the PowerPoint, if you're looking at it, we will cover those questions in class, so don't worry about those. We'll go over those later. Thank you so much for listening and have a good day.